The past never truly disappears. It only waits, lurking in the shadows, until the right moment to resurface. A father on his deathbed receives a letter that shatters everything he believed to be true. His daughter, missing for 33 years, is alive. But how? And why now? As his last strength fades, he turns to the only person he can trust. His son, Michael, who embarks on a journey filled with haunting secrets, betrayals, and shocking revelations. What happened to Ashley? Where has she been all these years? And why does every clue seem to lead to a truth more painful than the mystery itself? Stay with us until the end of this incredible story, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The answers you seek might be more unsettling than you expect. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the hospital room, mixing with the distant hum of machines that kept time in slow, agonizing beeps. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting shadows on the frail figure lying in the bed. James Carter's breath was shallow, his once strong hands trembling as he gripped the thin sheet covering his weakened body. His vision blurred as he stared at the envelope in his lap. His heart pounded, not from his failing health, but from the words written in jagged ink across the aged paper. Ashley is alive. A choked sound escaped his throat, a mix between a sob and a gasp. His fingers traced the letters, as if touching the ink would make it real. 33 years. 33 years of grief, of nightmares, of unanswered questions. 33 years of staring at a photograph of his daughter, frozen in time as an 8-year-old girl, her bright eyes full of a future that never came. His wife, Laura, had vanished with her, disappearing into nothing, leaving behind only confusion and brokenness. He had given up. He had believed they were gone forever. But this letter was proof that he had been wrong. "Dad!" The voice snapped James from his trance. He turned his head with difficulty, his sunken eyes meeting the concerned gaze of his son, Michael. Michael, now 42, had grown into a man James barely recognized, practical, skeptical, always focused on what made sense. His dark hair had started to gray at the temples, stress lines marking his face. A man who had learned, too young, that life was unfair. Michael stepped closer to the bed, noting the way his father's hand shook around the letter. "What is that?" James swallowed hard, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's her, Michael. She's alive." Michael frowned, reaching for the letter, but James clutched it tighter. "Dad, what are you talking about?" James inhaled sharply, forcing himself to steady his breath. "Ashley, someone sent this letter. Someone knows where she is." Michael exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. "Dad, we've been through this. We searched. For years. The police, the private investigators, there was nothing. We have to accept that." No, James' grip on his son's wrist was surprisingly strong for a man so weak. "I was wrong to stop looking. And now, I don't have time." His voice cracked, desperation bleeding through. "You have to find her, Michael. You have to bring her home." Michael hesitated. His father had spent decades haunted by their disappearance, grasping at theories, falling into grief-fueled delusions. Was this just another desperate attempt to hold onto hope before the inevitable? But something in James' eyes was different this time. Michael sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Where did this come from?" James' fingers trembled as he held out the envelope. "A nurse brought it to me. Said someone left it at the front desk." Michael took it, examining the paper. No return address. No stamp. Whoever sent it had delivered it in person. He unfolded the letter, his stomach tightening as he reread the words. "Ashley is alive." That was all. No explanation. No clue. Just those 3 words. His father was watching him intently, his breath ragged. "Please, Michael." Michael exhaled slowly. His logical mind told him this was insanity. But something inside him, something deep and unresolved, whispered otherwise. "I'll look into it." James' expression crumpled with relief. "Start with the letter. Find out who sent it." Michael nodded, slipping the paper into his pocket. "I will." His father's grip loosened, his eyelids growing heavy. "Don't waste time. It's running out." Michael sat in silence, watching as his father drifted into an uneasy sleep. His breathing shallow but steady. He clenched his jaw. This was probably nothing. A cruel joke or a misunderstanding. But something inside him, it was more than obligation, more than sympathy. It was something unresolved, buried beneath years of pretending not to care. He had to know the truth. He left the hospital, the crisp night air biting against his skin. The city lights blurred against the sky, cold and distant. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number of the hospital front desk. "This is Michael Carter. My father received a letter today. Do you know who dropped it off?" The receptionist's voice was soft but hesitant. I'm not sure, sir. The nurse said it was a woman, but she didn't get a good look. She left quickly." "A woman?" His pulse quickened. "Did she leave a name?" "No, sir. I'm sorry, but..." The woman hesitated. "But what?" "The nurse said she had familiar eyes. That's all she could remember." Michael lowered the phone slowly, a strange chill running through him. Familiar eyes. He barely slept that night. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "Ashley is alive." The words taunted him. He pulled out an old photo of his sister, the only one he had left. A little girl with golden brown curls, laughing in the summer sun. A girl who had vanished without a trace. By morning, he had made a decision. He would find out the truth, even if it led him somewhere he wasn't ready to go. Michael had always been a rational man. A man who dealt in facts, not feelings. He had spent his entire life learning how to compartmentalize, how to bury pain beneath layers of practicality. But as he sat in his car outside the hospital, gripping the letter in his hands, he felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Unease, a gnawing, unfamiliar sensation that whispered in the back of his mind. What if it's true? The morning sun was barely rising, casting a dull gray light over the city. The streets were still quiet, save for the occasional car passing by. He knew he should go home, shower, and get some rest. But he couldn't shake the words his father had spoken. Desperate, pleading. Start with the letter. Find out who sent it. He sighed, running a hand over his face. He had no leads, no evidence. Nothing except a single phrase written in ink. But there was one place he could start, the hospital security desk. If someone had delivered this letter in person, there had to be footage. Michael pushed open the doors of the hospital, the smell of antiseptic stinging his nose. The front desk receptionist, a woman in her mid-50s with tired eyes, looked up as he approached. "Mr. Carter," she greeted, her voice cautious. "Back so soon?" Michael nodded, placing the letter on the desk. "I need to see the security footage from last night. My father received this letter, and I need to know who delivered it." The receptionist hesitated. I don't think I'm authorized to show you that." Michael leaned in, his voice firm but controlled. "My father is dying. This letter, whoever sent it, it changes everything. Please." She sighed, glancing around before lowering her voice. "The security office is in the East Wing. I can't guarantee they'll let you see anything, but if you tell them it's about a possible breach of patient privacy, they might make an exception." Michael nodded his thanks and made his way to the East Wing, his heart pounding just a little too fast. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to find. Maybe proof that this was a mistake, that his father's mind had simply conjured false hope in his final days. Or maybe, deep down, he was hoping for something else. A tired-looking security guard sat behind a desk cluttered with coffee cups and paperwork. He barely looked up when Michael walked in. "Help you?" Michael placed the letter on the desk. "This was delivered last night to my father's hospital room. He's a terminal patient. I need to know who brought it." The guard sighed. "I'd need a request from the hospital admin." Michael clenched his jaw. "There's no time for that. Just check the cameras." The guard studied him for a moment, then grumbled under his breath. "Fine. What time?" "Around 8:30 last night." The guard clicked through footage on the monitor, fast-forwarding through mundane hospital activity. And then Michael's breath caught. A figure appeared at the front desk. A woman. The footage was grainy, the lighting poor, but he could make out the shape of her. Petite, wearing a long coat, a hood partially covering her hair. She approached the receptionist, handed over the letter, and then she hesitated. Even through the low-resolution footage, Michael could see it. The way she lingered, her fingers twitching at her side as if she wanted to say something. And then, just like that, she turned and walked away. The camera followed her as she exited through the front doors. She never looked back. Michael leaned forward, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Can you zoom in on her face?" The guard clicked a few buttons, adjusting the image. The woman's face was partially obscured by shadows, but Michael's breath hitched. Her eyes, there was something about them, something achingly familiar. His fingers curled against the desk. "Can you pull footage from outside?" "The parking lot." The guard sighed but complied, switching to the exterior cameras. Michael watched as the woman stepped onto the sidewalk, glancing around as if afraid of being seen. A car pulled up, a dark sedan with tinted windows. She got in and then it was gone. Michael stared at the screen, his mind racing. Who was she? Why did she look so familiar? And why did something deep inside him tell him that he had just seen a ghost? He left the hospital with more questions than answers, gripping the letter like it held some unspoken truth. His next step was clear. He needed to find out where this car had gone. It was time to start digging. Back in his apartment, Michael booted up his laptop, accessing a few online resources he had picked up over the years. He had learned a thing or two from his father's years of desperate searching, and one of those things was how to track a license plate. He rewound the hospital footage he had recorded on his phone, pausing the moment the sedan appeared. The plate was partially visible, but some of the numbers were clear. After an hour of cross-checking databases, he had a hit. The car was registered to a Susan Whitmore. Michael frowned, tapping his fingers against the desk. He didn't recognize the name, but there was an address, and he was going to find out who she was. The drive took 45 minutes, leading him out of the city and into a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house was modest, well-maintained, with a garden lined with carefully trimmed hedges. There was nothing about it that screamed danger, but Michael had learned, long ago, that appearances meant nothing. He knocked on the door, his stomach twisting. He had no plan, no idea what he would say if someone answered. He only knew that he had come too far to turn back now. Footsteps. The door opened a crack, and Michael found himself staring into the eyes of the woman from the footage. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then her face paled. Her grip on the door tightened. Michael took a step forward, his voice low. "Who are you?" The woman swallowed hard, her gaze flickering past him as if expecting someone else. "You shouldn't be here." Michael's pulse pounded. "You delivered a letter to my father." She hesitated. "I don't know what you're talking about." He pulled the letter from his pocket, holding it up. You wrote this." She inhaled sharply, her expression crumbling for a split second before she masked it with forced calm. "You have to leave." Michael took another step. "Not until you tell me what you know." The woman clenched her jaw. For a long moment, she seemed to be at war with herself. Then, finally, she exhaled shakily and whispered, "It's not safe." Michael stiffened. "What do you mean?" She glanced over her shoulder as if someone might be listening. Then she looked back at him, her eyes dark with something he couldn't quite place. And then she said the words that sent a chill down his spine. "She's alive, but you're not the only one looking for her." Michael's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the woman standing in the doorway, her face pale, her lips pressed into a tight line. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what she had just said. "She's alive, but you're not the only one looking for her." The words echoed in his head, making his pulse thunder in his ears. His fingers curled around the letter in his pocket. "Who else is looking for her?" His voice was low, steady, but he felt anything but calm. The woman glanced over her shoulder again, hesitation flickering in her eyes. Then, with a sharp inhale, she pushed the door open wider. "Come inside. I don't want anyone seeing us talking." Michael hesitated only for a moment before stepping in. The house was modest, neat, with the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. The living room was decorated with simple furniture, worn but well-kept. It was the kind of house that looked normal, lived in. But there was tension in the air, an unspoken weight hanging between them. The woman locked the door behind him before turning to face him. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into." Michael studied her, trying to place her age. She was probably in her late 50s, her hair a mixture of dark brown and silver streaks. There was something familiar about her face, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. "You delivered the letter to my father," he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded, crossing her arms. "Yes." "Why?" She exhaled slowly, as if steadying herself. "Because he deserved to know. He deserved the truth before it was too late." Michael narrowed his eyes. "What truth?" The woman hesitated. "Your sister, Ashley. She's alive. But she doesn't know who she is." Michael's jaw tightened. "What does that mean?" She looked away for a moment, her expression troubled. She was taken and given a new life, a new identity. She grew up never knowing who she really was. Michael's pulse pounded. "By who?" The woman's eyes flickered with something, regret, maybe even fear. "By people who thought they were protecting her." Michael took a slow step forward. "And you? Who are you?" The woman swallowed. "My name is Susan Whitmore. I knew your mother." Michael stiffened. "My mother's been gone for 33 years. A long silence stretched between them. Then Susan whispered, "She's not gone." Michael's breath caught. "What?" Susan's gaze met his, steady and unwavering. "Your mother never died. She's alive." Michael shook his head. "No, that's not possible. The police said." "The police never found her body," Susan interrupted. "Because there was no body to find." Michael felt the air leave his lungs. His mother, the woman he had mourned for most of his life, the woman he had grieved alongside his father. Alive? He ran a hand through his hair, trying to process what she was saying. "If my mother is alive, where has she been all these years?" Susan hesitated again, her fingers gripping the edge of a chair. "Hiding. Hiding from what?" Susan exhaled, her shoulders sagging slightly. "From the same people who took Ashley." Michael clenched his jaw. "I need answers, Susan. No more half-truths. Tell me everything." She studied him for a moment before finally nodding. "Fine. But once I tell you, there's no turning back." Michael's stomach tightened, but he squared his shoulders. "I don't care. I need to know the truth." Susan gestured toward the couch. "Sit down." Michael reluctantly obeyed, his mind still spinning. Susan sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly together. "Your mother and I were best friends. We grew up together. When she married your father, we stayed close. And when she had you and Ashley, I was there. I watched your family grow." She paused, her gaze darkening. But then, something changed. Michael listened intently, his heart hammering. Susan inhaled deeply. "Your mother, she found out something. Something she wasn't supposed to know. And it put all of you in danger." Michael frowned. "What do you mean?" Susan's lips pressed together. "She discovered that Ashley was being watched. That someone was planning to take her." Michael felt his stomach drop. "Why? Why would anyone want to take an 8-year-old girl?" Susan shook her head. "Because Ashley wasn't just any child. There was something about her. Something they wanted to control." Michael's mind reeled. "Who are they?" Susan hesitated, then finally whispered, "Dr. Evelyn Carter." Michael blinked. "Who?" Susan's expression darkened. "A woman who was once close to your family. A doctor your mother trusted. Someone who convinced her she was a friend." Michael searched his memory, but the name didn't ring a bell. "And what does she have to do with Ashley?" Susan took a slow breath. "She's the one who took her." Michael's hands curled into fists. "Why?" Susan's gaze was steady. "Because she believed she was protecting her." Michael's head spun. "Protecting her from what?" Susan looked away. "That's something only your mother can tell you." Michael felt frustration coil in his chest. "Then where is she?" Where is my mother? Susan hesitated before answering. I don't know. Michael gritted his teeth. That's not good enough. Susan's expression softened. I know it's not, but I swear to you, I've spent years trying to find her. And now, I think she's been trying to find you. Michael's pulse quickened. Why now? Why after all these years? Susan hesitated again. Because she knows she's running out of time. Michael felt the weight of those words settle over him. His mother alive. Ashley out there somewhere unaware of who she really was. And someone else, someone dangerous, also searching for her. He exhaled slowly, his mind whirling. Where do I start? Susan hesitated, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, weathered envelope. Your mother left this for you. Michael stared at it, his throat tightening. Read it, Susan urged. His fingers trembled slightly as he took the envelope, carefully tearing it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. His mother's handwriting, familiar, haunting, filled the page. Michael, if you're reading this, it means I failed. I never wanted you to be part of this, but I should have known you'd find your way here. There are things I cannot explain in writing. Things that will change everything you thought you knew. But you need to find Ashley. And when you do, you'll understand. I'm sorry for everything. Please forgive me. Love, Mom. Michael swallowed hard, his vision blurring slightly. Susan's voice was soft. Now do you believe me? Michael folded the letter carefully, slipping it back into the envelope. He stood slowly, his chest tight with emotions he didn't have time to process. I have to find them. Susan nodded. Then you need to start where it all began. Michael frowned. And where's that? Susan exhaled. Your childhood home. Michael's pulse quickened. The house he had left behind decades ago. The house where his family had lived before everything fell apart. Susan met his gaze. Your mother hid something there. Something she wanted you to find. And I think it's time. Michael inhaled deeply, nodding once. He had no idea what he was about to uncover. But he was ready. Michael drove in silence, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The weight of everything he had learned pressed against his chest like a stone. His mother was alive. Ashley was alive. And neither of them had been lost by accident. Someone had taken them. Someone had hidden them. And now, after more than 3 decades, the truth was starting to unravel. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what he was about to find. But that no longer mattered. He had a destination. His childhood home. The house had been abandoned for years. After his mother and sister disappeared, his father had tried to stay, but the walls had become too haunted with memories. Eventually, they had moved to a smaller apartment in the city, and the house had been left to rot. He hadn't been back since he was a teenager. He had forced himself to forget it. But now, standing in front of the overgrown yard, staring up at the darkened windows, he realized that the house had never forgotten him. The wooden steps creaked under his weight as he climbed the porch, the paint peeling from years of neglect. He ran a hand over the old brass doorknob, hesitating. His childhood had ended in this house. His family had shattered within these walls. And now he was about to walk back inside, chasing ghosts. He turned the knob. The door groaned open, revealing a dimly lit hallway coated in dust. The air was thick, stale, untouched by time. He stepped inside cautiously, his shoes leaving imprints in the thick layer of dust covering the floor. The furniture was still there, covered with white sheets like abandoned relics. Michael's eyes swept the living room, the couch where his mother used to sit and read to him and Ashley, the fireplace where they had spent Christmas mornings, the walls where his father's laughter had once filled the space before everything changed. A lump formed in his throat, but he forced himself to move forward. He wasn't here for nostalgia. He was here for answers. Susan had said his mother hid something in this house. But what? And where? His fingers brushed over an old photo frame resting on a dust-covered table. It was cracked, the glass spider-webbed, but beneath it was an image of his family. His father, his mother, Ashley, and himself. A moment frozen in time. He traced his mother's face with his thumb, feeling a strange ache in his chest. You need to start where it all began. Michael inhaled deeply. Where had it all begun? The kitchen. He turned, walking down the hall to the room where his mother had spent so much time. The air was heavy with forgotten memories. The cabinets were still intact, though their doors hung slightly askew. The countertops were covered in dust. But something caught his eye. The floor. One of the tiles near the sink looked different. Michael crouched, running his fingers over the surface. It was loose. He wedged his fingers beneath the edge and carefully lifted it. His heart pounded. Beneath the tile was a small metal box. Rusted. Old. He pulled it out, wiping the dust off with his sleeve. His fingers trembled slightly as he pried the lid open. Inside, there were several pieces of folded paper yellowed with age. A key. And a photograph. Michael picked up the photo first. It was of his mother, older than she had been when she disappeared. Her face lined with exhaustion, but her eyes still holding that same quiet strength he remembered. And standing next to her, his breath hitched. Ashley. Not the 8-year-old girl from his memories. A young woman. Michael's fingers tightened around the edges of the photo. This was proof. Proof that his mother had been alive after her disappearance. Proof that Ashley had grown up. His eyes dropped to the papers. He carefully unfolded the first one. His mother's handwriting instantly recognizable. Michael, if you're reading this, it means you've found your way back. It means you're looking for answers. There are things I never told you, things I couldn't tell you, but you deserve to know the truth. Ashley was taken because of who she was, because of what she knew. And if you're reading this, it means it's time to find her. Michael swallowed hard, his hands shaking slightly. The second note was shorter. Go to 187 Rosewood Lane. Ask for Evelyn. She will tell you everything. Michael's blood ran cold. Evelyn. Dr. Evelyn Carter. The name Susan had mentioned. His mother had written this letter years ago, which meant she had known Evelyn, trusted her. Michael's mind raced. Could Evelyn be the key to everything? His eyes dropped to the last item in the box. The key. He picked it up, running his fingers over the cool metal. It was small, unmarked, but it was meant for something. His mother had left him this puzzle. Now it was his job to solve it. Michael exhaled sharply, shoving the papers, the key, and the photograph into his pocket. He wasn't wasting another second. As he turned to leave, something caught his attention. A sound. A soft creak. His body went rigid. He wasn't alone. Michael spun around, his pulse hammering. The house was silent. Too silent. He listened, his breath shallow. And then another creak. Upstairs. His heart pounded. Had someone followed him? He moved cautiously, stepping toward the staircase. The steps groaned under his weight as he ascended. The second floor was darker, the air heavier. He hesitated at the top, scanning the hallway. A shadow shifted near the end of the hall. Michael's breath hitched. He took a slow step forward. Who's there? Silence. His fingers clenched. He was done being afraid. He moved toward the last door on the right, his old bedroom. He pushed it open slowly, the hinges whining. Empty. The room was just as he had left it all those years ago. The bed, the desk, the bookshelves. But something felt off. His eyes scanned the space. And then he saw it. A small, folded note on the desk. He swallowed hard, stepping closer. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up. 3 words were scrawled across the page. You're not alone. Michael's breath hitched. This note wasn't old. Someone had been here, and they wanted him to know it. His grip tightened on the paper. Whoever had left this message, they were watching him. And that meant they knew he was getting closer to the truth. Michael exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He wasn't going to let fear stop him. Not now. He folded the note carefully, slipping it into his pocket. Then, without another glance back, he turned and left the house. His next stop was clear. 187 Rosewood Lane. Whoever Evelyn was, she had the answers. And Michael was finally ready to hear them. Michael gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove through the quiet streets. his mind racing with everything he had just uncovered. The photograph of his mother and Ashley, the letters, the cryptic message left inside his childhood home. And now this address, 187 Rosewood Lane. Whoever Evelyn was, his mother had trusted her enough to leave her name in a hidden note. That meant she was either part of the mystery or the key to solving it. Either way, Michael was about to find out. The city lights faded as he drove further out, the buildings giving way to suburban streets lined with trees, their branches arching like skeletal fingers over the road. The houses were older, well-maintained, but carrying the weight of time. He checked the address again. 187 Rosewood Lane. He was close. When he finally pulled up to the house, he hesitated. It was nothing remarkable. A two-story home with a wraparound porch, the paint slightly faded but not neglected. A single light glowed from inside, casting a warm hue through the lace curtains. Michael cut the engine and sat in silence for a moment, his heart pounding. Was he ready for this? Would Evelyn even tell him the truth? He exhaled sharply. There was only one way to find out. He stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath his feet as he approached the porch. With every step, the weight in his chest grew heavier. He knocked firmly, his fingers curling into a fist as he waited. Silence. Then the faintest sound of movement inside. A hesitation. Then the lock clicked, and the door creaked open. An older woman stood in the doorway, her gray eyes sharp and calculating. Her hair was silver, pulled back neatly, and her expression was unreadable. She studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. "You look just like your mother." Michael's breath caught. "You knew her?" Evelyn nodded, stepping aside. "Come in." He hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. The house smelled of old books and faint traces of lavender, the kind of scent that clung to memories. The living room was filled with worn furniture, bookshelves lining the walls, and photographs. So many photographs. Evelyn motioned to a chair. "Sit." Michael did, his fingers twitching slightly. "You knew my mother," he repeated. "You left this address for her. Why?" Evelyn studied him for a moment, then exhaled. "Because she trusted me, and because she knew one day you'd come looking for the truth." Michael leaned forward. "Then tell me. No more riddles. No more cryptic notes. Just the truth." Evelyn's gaze softened slightly. "You think you're ready for it?" Michael's jaw tightened. "I don't have a choice." Evelyn nodded slowly, as if weighing her decision. Then she stood, crossing the room to a cabinet. She unlocked a drawer, pulling out a thick folder. She placed it on the table between them, her fingers lingering over the cover before finally pushing it toward him. "This is everything." Michael hesitated before flipping it open. The first thing he saw was a photograph. A familiar face stared back at him. Ashley. But not the child he remembered. A woman, her hair pulled back, her expression unreadable. Michael's stomach twisted. "Where is she?" Evelyn sighed. "She doesn't know who she is, Michael." He frowned. "What do you mean?" Evelyn folded her hands in her lap. "When your mother realized Ashley was in danger, she made the hardest decision of her life. She gave her up. Not in the way you think. She arranged for her to be placed with another family, under a new identity. A life where she would be safe." Michael's chest tightened. "She erased her." Evelyn's expression was pained. "She saved her." Michael clenched his fists. "And you helped." Evelyn hesitated before nodding. "I did what I had to do." Michael's mind reeled. His mother had been alive all this time. Ashley had grown up under a different name, a different family, and yet, his father had been left in the dark, drowning in grief. He swallowed hard. Who raised her? Evelyn hesitated. A couple. They had no idea who she really was. To them, she was just a little girl who needed a home. Michael ran a hand through his hair. "So she has no memory of us?" Evelyn shook her head. "None." Michael exhaled sharply, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Then how do I find her?" Evelyn reached into the folder again, pulling out a slip of paper. She slid it toward him. Michael's eyes scanned the writing. It was an address. His heart pounded. This is where she lives? Evelyn nodded. But you need to understand something, Michael. She doesn't know you. She doesn't remember any of this. To her, you're a stranger. Michael swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had spent his entire life wondering if his sister was dead, only to find out she had been alive all along. And now, she was out there, completely unaware of who she really was. He clenched his jaw. I have to see her, Evelyn sighed, leaning back in her chair. Then you better be prepared for the consequences. Michael pocketed the address, his fingers curling around the paper. He didn't care about the consequences. He was going to find her. And this time, he wasn't going to lose her again. Michael barely felt his fingers tighten around the slip of paper as he stepped out of Evelyn's house and into the cold night air. His mind was racing too fast to process anything else. The address burned in his palm, a tangible link to a sister he had spent decades mourning. A sister who was alive. A sister who didn't even know he existed. His chest felt heavy with the weight of it. How did you find someone who didn't know they were lost? How did you tell someone that their entire life had been built on a lie? The drive back into the city was a blur. The streets passed in streaks of light and shadow, headlights flashing like ghosts against the windshield. Michael barely registered the turns, the stops, the world moving around him. He kept replaying Evelyn's words in his head. Ashley doesn't know who she is. To her, you're a stranger. Be prepared for the consequences. What kind of consequences? He clenched his jaw. He didn't care. He had spent years buried in a past he thought was closed forever. And now, for the first time, he had a reason to dig it all back up. He had spent too long in the dark. He wasn't going to stop now. By the time he pulled up outside his apartment, exhaustion was clawing at his bones. But his mind was still too restless to consider sleep. He locked the door behind him, tossing his keys onto the counter. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the distant honk of a car somewhere below. He pulled the paper from his pocket, unfolding it slowly. Rebecca Lawson. The name was foreign to him, but he knew better now. It wasn't real. It was the name they had given her, the life they had built for her, the lie she had been living. And beneath it, an address. He exhaled sharply, his grip tightening on the paper. It was only a few hours' drive away. Not far, but far enough that it had kept them apart for more than 30 years. Michael ran a hand over his face. He needed to think, needed to figure out how to approach this. He couldn't just show up at her doorstep and announce that he was her long-lost brother. That wasn't how this worked. He had no idea what kind of life she had, what kind of family she had built for herself. He had no idea if she was happy. And if she had a good life, a life untouched by the pain that had followed him for years. What right did he have to ruin it? Michael sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. He had spent years wanting answers. But what if Rebecca, didn't want them? The thought made his chest tighten. But he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not after everything. Michael barely slept that night. When he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of memories he had tried to bury. Ashley's laughter. The way she used to cling to his arm when she was scared. The way their mother would hum softly while cooking breakfast. And then the memories darkened. The empty house. The silence that followed their disappearance. The years of searching, of grief, of finally giving up. Morning came too soon. The city was already awake. Moving, buzzing with life. Michael barely registered it as he packed a bag. Just in case. He wasn't sure how long this would take. Or what he would find. The highway stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the trees. The miles passed in silence. He didn't bother with music or the radio. His thoughts were too loud. The town where Rebecca lived was smaller than he expected. Quaint, quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. He could already feel eyes on him as he drove down the narrow streets, scanning house numbers. And then there it was. A modest house with a small front porch, flowers lining the walkway. It was simple, unremarkable, but it was hers. Michael pulled to a stop across the street, his hands tightening around the wheel. She was in there, his sister, Ashley, but he couldn't move. For the first time since this all began, Hesitation clawed at him. He had spent years searching for her. But now that she was right in front of him, the fear was overwhelming. What if she didn't believe him? What if she wanted nothing to do with him? What if this was a mistake? His grip on the wheel tightened. He had come too far to back out now. Michael took a deep breath, forcing himself to move. He stepped out of the car, his legs feeling heavier than they should. Every step toward the house felt impossible. His pulse was too fast, his breath too shallow. He stopped at the front door, staring at it like it might disappear if he blinked. This was it. Michael lifted his hand and knocked. The seconds stretched endlessly, and then the door opened. Michael's breath caught in his throat. She stood there, staring at him. Ashley. But not the little girl he remembered. Not the child frozen in time. She was a woman now. Her hair was darker than he remembered, pulled back in a loose ponytail. Her eyes, his mother's eyes, were wide, cautious. There was something familiar about her expression, but there was no recognition, because to her he was a stranger. Michael swallowed hard. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Rebecca." She frowned slightly, tilting her head. "Yes." Michael exhaled slowly. I'm sorry to show up like this. I know this is unexpected, but..." He hesitated. "My name is Michael Carter." She blinked, confusion flickering across her face. I think you knew me once," he interrupted gently. His heart pounded. "A long time ago." She hesitated. He could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the way she shifted slightly, like her instincts were telling her something was off. "I'm sorry," she said finally, shaking her head. "I think you have the wrong person." Michael swallowed hard. "I don't." She stared at him, and for a moment, there was something there, just for a second. A flicker of something deeper. And then, before he could say anything else, a voice called from inside the house. "Rebecca? Who is it?" Michael stiffened. Ashley. Rebecca turned slightly, glancing over her shoulder. "It's no one," she called back. "No one." The word hit Michael harder than he expected. She turned back to him, apologetic. "I have to go." Michael's pulse hammered. He couldn't let this slip away. "Please," he said, his voice tight. Just give me 5 minutes. That's all I ask." She hesitated. And then, finally, she exhaled, stepping out onto the porch, closing the door behind her. 5 minutes, she said, crossing her arms. "Then you need to go." Michael nodded. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough. Michael's heart pounded as he stood on the porch, staring at his sister. Rebecca, as she called herself now. Ashley, as he had known her. 33 years had passed since she had vanished. But standing here now, she wasn't just a ghost from his past. She was real, flesh and bone, standing only feet away from him. And she had no idea who he was. She crossed her arms, her posture guarded. 5 minutes, she repeated. "Then you need to go." Michael exhaled, forcing himself to steady his voice. "I know this is strange. I know I probably sound like a lunatic showing up at your house like this, but I promise you, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't important." Her expression remained unreadable, but she didn't move. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to figure out how to say this in a way that wouldn't scare her off. I think you and I are connected, in a way you might not remember." Rebecca frowned slightly, shifting her weight. "What do you mean?" Michael hesitated. He could feel the seconds slipping away, his chance narrowing. He had to make this count. "You were adopted, right?" he asked carefully. Rebecca stiffened just slightly, but it was enough. Michael felt a rush of certainty. "That's not really a coincidence," he continued. "I think there's more to your story than what you've been told." Rebecca's eyes darkened. "Who told you that?" Michael hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I found something that led me to you. A photograph, letters, a name, your real name." Rebecca's breath hitched just slightly. It was almost imperceptible, but Michael caught it. "You don't remember, do you?" he asked, his voice soft now. "Anything from before?" Rebecca's lips parted, but no words came out. "I don't know what you've been told about your childhood," Michael continued, his heart pounding. "But I do know one thing. You had a family before this one. A mother, a father, a brother." Rebecca's hands tightened around her arms. Michael swallowed. "You had me." For a long, unbearable moment, she didn't speak. Then, she let out a small, disbelieving laugh, shaking her head. "Okay," she muttered. "I think this conversation is over." Michael's stomach twisted. "Wait. No." Her voice was sharper now, more certain. She took a step back, reaching for the door handle. "I don't know who you are, but you need to leave. Now." Michael clenched his jaw, his pulse hammering. He was losing her. Desperation clawed at his chest. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the photograph Evelyn had given him. The one of Ashley, Rebecca, standing beside their mother. He held it up for her to see. "Please," he whispered. "Just look." Rebecca hesitated. Her eyes flickered to the photo, and for the first time, her guarded expression cracked. She reached out slowly, almost as if she wasn't aware she was doing it. Her fingers brushed the edge of the photograph as she took it from him. Michael held his breath as she studied it. She blinked, and then, suddenly, she inhaled sharply, her entire body going rigid. Michael saw it happen, the exact moment something shifted inside her. Her fingers trembled as she stared at the image. "This isn't real," she whispered. "It is," Michael said quietly. "That's you. And that's our mother." Rebecca shook her head, but she didn't let go of the photograph. "No," she murmured. I don't remember this. I don't know this woman." Michael's throat tightened. "You do," he said. "Somewhere, deep down, you do." Rebecca looked up at him then, her eyes wide, filled with something between fear and something else. Something raw. "Who are you?" she whispered. Michael swallowed hard. "I'm your brother." A silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then, Rebecca took a step back, shaking her head. "I can't do this," she murmured. Michael's stomach clenched. "Rebecca!" "No." Her voice was sharper now, her hands trembling. "I don't know you. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I need you to leave." Michael exhaled, his heart aching. "I know this is a lot," he said softly. "I know it doesn't make sense yet, but I'm telling you the truth." Rebecca's fingers curled into fists. "I don't want to hear it." Michael clenched his jaw. He wanted to push, to make her see, but he knew he couldn't force this. He took a slow step back, nodding. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll go." Rebecca exhaled sharply, like she hadn't realized she had been holding her breath. Michael turned, walking slowly back toward his car. He didn't look back, even though every part of him wanted to. He climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel tightly. For a long time, he just sat there. And then, just as he was about to start the engine, something happened. The front door opened again. Michael's breath caught as he saw Rebecca standing on the porch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She was staring at him. Michael held his breath, waiting. And then, slowly, hesitantly, she stepped forward. Not much. Just enough to tell him she wasn't ready to let this go. Michael swallowed hard. It wasn't much, but it was something. Michael didn't move. He barely breathed. Rebecca stood on the porch, her arms still wrapped around herself like she was holding onto something fragile. Something she wasn't sure she was ready to let go of. The weight of silence stretched between them, thick and uncertain. Michael's hands tightened around the steering wheel. He could feel the hesitation in her, the war inside her mind. She wanted to turn around, to pretend this never happened, but something was stopping her. Something deeper. A memory, maybe. A whisper of something she couldn't quite place. Michael knew he had to tread carefully. One wrong word, one wrong move, and she would retreat. And this time, she might not come back. Slowly, he opened the car door, stepping out. He didn't move closer, he didn't dare. He just stood there, waiting. Rebecca's fingers tightened around the photograph he had given her, her knuckles turning white. Her eyes flickered back to his, and for the first time, There was no anger, no suspicion, just confusion. "I don't understand," she said quietly. Michael exhaled slowly, his chest tightening. "I know," he murmured. "I don't expect you to. Not yet." Rebecca looked down at the photo again. She swallowed hard. "This woman," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You said she's my mother." Michael nodded, his throat thick. "She is." Rebecca let out a shaky breath. I don't remember her." Michael felt his heart twist. "That's not your fault." Rebecca glanced up at him sharply, something flickering in her gaze. "Then whose fault is it?" Michael hesitated. How could he even begin to answer that? How could he tell her that her entire life had been orchestrated, that she had been taken, erased, rebuilt into someone else? He chose his words carefully. There were people who wanted to keep you safe, people who thought this was the only way. Rebecca shook her head. "Safe from what?" Michael swallowed hard. "That's what I'm trying to find out." She looked away, her jaw tightening. Michael could see the storm building inside her, the cracks forming in the life she had always known. She wanted to walk away from this. He could see it in the way her fingers twitched at her sides, in the way she kept glancing back at the door, like she wanted to disappear inside and pretend this never happened. But she didn't. Instead, she whispered, "Why now?" Michael hesitated. "Because I found out the truth," he said carefully. "And because I think—" He took a breath. "I think someone else is looking for you, too." Rebecca stiffened. "What?" Michael stepped closer now, just enough to show her that he wasn't going anywhere. "I don't know who they are yet, but I know they've been following me, leaving messages, watching." Rebecca's breath hitched. "Watching you?" Michael nodded. "And if they know about me, they know about you." Rebecca's fingers curled around the photograph, her entire body tensing. She was afraid. Michael softened his voice. "I don't want to scare you," he said gently, "but I need you to understand that this isn't just about the past. Someone is still trying to keep you hidden." Rebecca swallowed hard. "That doesn't make sense. Why would anyone care about me? I'm just me." Michael shook his head. "You're not just anyone, Rebecca. And deep down, I think you know that." She stared at him, her breath uneven. "I don't know anything." Michael watched her carefully. "Maybe not yet," he murmured. "But I think you're starting to remember." Rebecca's lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. Then, suddenly, the front door behind her opened. Michael tensed instantly, his instincts kicking in. A man stepped outside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his expression unreadable as he looked between Rebecca and Michael. His posture was protective, his eyes sharp. "Rebecca!" Rebecca inhaled quickly, taking a step back toward the door. "It's fine, Daniel," she said, her voice tight. Michael kept his expression neutral, but inside, his mind was racing. Daniel. Who was he? Rebecca's husband? Boyfriend? He didn't know why the thought made something tighten in his chest. But it did. Daniel looked at Michael now, his gaze cool. "Who is this?" Michael hesitated, glancing at Rebecca. Her expression was torn. For a long moment, she didn't answer. And then, finally, she said, He's my brother." Michael's breath caught. She had said it. She had acknowledged it. Daniel's expression flickered, but he didn't react. He just studied Michael for a long moment before finally speaking. "I think you should come inside." Michael glanced at Rebecca. She didn't say anything, but she didn't tell him to leave either. She turned, walking inside. Michael followed. The house was warm, lived in. Photos lined the walls, but none of them were from before. None of them showed the little girl he remembered. Rebecca sat down slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the table in the dining room. Daniel stood beside her, his arms crossed, his eyes never leaving Michael. Michael sat across from them, exhaling slowly. "Okay," Rebecca murmured. "Tell me everything." Michael swallowed. "It's a long story." Rebecca's fingers curled against the table. "I have time." Michael nodded. And then, finally, he began. Michael exhaled slowly, his hands clasped together on the table. Across from him, Rebecca sat stiffly, her fingers gripping the edge of her chair like she was bracing herself for impact. Daniel stood behind her, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The weight of what Michael was about to say hung between them, thick and suffocating. Rebecca had given him a chance. She had let him in. Now he had to make her believe. He ran a hand through his hair, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know where to start." Rebecca's voice was quiet but firm. "Start with the truth." Michael swallowed hard. 33 years ago, you disappeared." Rebecca blinked, but she didn't interrupt. Michael continued. "You were 8 years old. It was a normal day. Mom took you to the mall. And then you were gone. Both of you. No leads. No witnesses. Just gone." Rebecca's fingers twitched against the table. Michael could see her pulse beating rapidly at her throat. Daniel shifted slightly behind her. "And you think she was taken?" Michael nodded. "I know she was." Rebecca let out a shaky breath. "By who?" Michael hesitated. "By people who thought they were protecting you." Rebecca's brow furrowed. "Protecting me from what?" Michael leaned forward slightly. "That's the part one don't fully understand yet. But I know it had to do with Mom. She found something she wasn't supposed to. And when she realized what was happening, she ran. She didn't trust the people who were trying to take you, so she made the hardest decision of her life. She gave you up before they could get to you." Rebecca's throat bobbed as she swallowed. "And you think I grew up with a different name? A different life?" Michael nodded. "I don't just think it. I know it." Rebecca's hands curled into fists. "That's insane." Michael's chest tightened. "I know it sounds that way, but deep down, doesn't something about your past feel off?" Rebecca inhaled sharply, her eyes flickering with something. Something deep, something buried. "I don't remember anything before I was 8. Her voice was barely a whisper now. "I've always told myself it was normal, that some kids just don't have early memories. But now," she shook her head. "Are you telling me that's not true? That someone took them from me?" Michael's heart pounded. "I think someone erased them." Rebecca flinched. "Why?" Michael exhaled. "That's what I need to find out." Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Rebecca whispered, "Do you have proof?" Michael hesitated for only a second before reaching into his jacket. He pulled out the photograph, the one of her and their mother. He slid it across the table. Rebecca's hands trembled as she picked it up. Her breath hitched audibly. She stared at it for a long time. Then her voice broke. "This is real." Michael's throat tightened. "Yes." Rebecca swallowed hard, her fingers brushing over the image. I don't understand. How could I not remember this?" Michael leaned forward. "Because someone didn't want you to." Rebecca's breath hitched. Daniel finally spoke, his voice cautious. "If this is true, who else knows?" Michael hesitated. "That's the part that worries me." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You think someone is looking for her now?" Michael met his gaze. "I know they are." Rebecca's hands clenched around the photograph. "Who?" Michael shook his head. "I don't know yet, but I know they've been following me, leaving messages, watching." Rebecca exhaled sharply, her body tensing. "Why now?" Michael hesitated. "Because I started looking for you." Rebecca's expression darkened. "And you led them to me." Michael's stomach twisted. "I didn't mean to." Rebecca closed her eyes, her breathing uneven. Michael felt his chest tighten. "I know this is a lot. I know it's overwhelming. But you have to believe me. You have to trust me." Rebecca looked up at him, her gaze unreadable. "I don't know if I can." Michael's heart pounded. "Then let me prove it to you." Rebecca hesitated. Then, finally, she whispered, "How?" Michael swallowed hard. "Come with me. Let's find Mom. Let's find the truth." Rebecca flinched at the word Mom, like it was foreign to her. Daniel tensed. "That's a big risk." Michael nodded. "I know." Rebecca exhaled shakily. "And if I go, what happens if I don't like what I find?" Michael held her gaze. "Then you walk away." No one will force you to stay. Rebecca swallowed. Michael softened his voice. But don't you want to know? Rebecca inhaled sharply. Yes. Michael's chest ached. Then come with me. Rebecca hesitated. Then finally she nodded. Michael let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Rebecca turned to Daniel. Daniel studied her for a long moment, his expression torn. Then finally he exhaled sharply. If you're going, I'm going too. Rebecca's breath caught. Daniel. Daniel shook his head. I'm not letting you go alone. Michael nodded. Then we leave tomorrow. Rebecca clenched her jaw. Where? Michael exhaled. To the last place Mom was seen. Rebecca's pulse pounded. And where is that? Michael looked at her. And then, finally, he said it. Our childhood home. Rebecca's breath hitched. Michael met her gaze. Are you ready? Rebecca exhaled slowly. Then, finally, she whispered, no, but she didn't say no to going. She just wasn't ready for the truth. Michael understood, but it was waiting for them anyway. The air was heavy with tension as Michael, Rebecca, and Daniel drove in silence toward the one place Michael had spent his whole life avoiding, their childhood home. It had been years since he had last seen it, and yet, every turn of the road felt familiar, like an old wound reopening. He stole a glance at Rebecca in the passenger seat. She hadn't spoken much since they left. Her fingers were clenched tightly around the edge of her coat, her knuckles white. She was afraid. Michael couldn't blame her. The truth was waiting for them at the end of this road, and none of them knew if they were ready for it. The house came into view, standing like a ghost at the end of the long driveway. The once white paint had faded to gray, the shutters hung crookedly, and the yard was overgrown, wild with neglect. It looked abandoned, forgotten, but Michael knew better. Something was still here. Rebecca inhaled sharply, her breath unsteady. I don't remember this place. Michael clenched the steering wheel. You might not, but I think this place remembers you. Rebecca shivered but said nothing. Daniel leaned forward from the back seat, his eyes scanning the house carefully. Are you sure no one lives here? Michael nodded. I checked. It's been vacant for years. But that didn't mean they were alone. He killed the engine, the silence swallowing them whole. No one moved. Michael finally exhaled, pushing open the car door. Gravel crunched beneath his boots as he stepped onto the driveway, his chest tightening. Rebecca hesitated before following, her arms wrapped around herself. Daniel came last, his stance protective as he glanced around. The front porch creaked beneath their weight as they climbed the steps. Michael reached for the door handle. It wasn't locked. His stomach twisted. Someone had been here. Rebecca shifted beside him, her body tense. Are you sure this is a good idea? Michael swallowed. No. Then he pushed the door open. The house smelled of dust and time. Everything was exactly as he had left it. The furniture covered in sheets, the air thick with the weight of forgotten memories. The silence was deafening. Michael stepped inside, his pulse hammering. We need to find what Mom left behind. Rebecca hesitated before following, her fingers brushing the edge of a covered table. I don't feel anything. Michael glanced at her. Not yet. Daniel moved cautiously, scanning the shadows. Where do we start? Michael exhaled. The basement. Rebecca tensed. Why there? Michael hesitated. Because that's where I found the first letter. Rebecca swallowed hard but nodded. The three of them moved through the house, their footsteps eerily loud against the wooden floor. Michael led the way to the basement door, his hand hovering over the knob. Something inside him screamed that they shouldn't go down there, but they had come too far to turn back now. He opened the door. The stairs groaned under their weight as they descended. The air grew colder, damp with the scent of earth and old wood. The basement was exactly as Michael remembered. Cramped, filled with forgotten boxes and relics of a life that had been ripped apart too soon. Rebecca hesitated at the bottom step, her breath shallow. What are we looking for? Michael moved toward the far wall. Anything that doesn't belong. Daniel grabbed a flashlight from a nearby shelf, sweeping the beam across the room. Shadows stretched against the walls, flickering with movement. Michael crouched beside an old cabinet, running his hands along the surface. And then he felt it. A groove, a hidden seam. His pulse quickened. "Help me move this." Daniel stepped forward, gripping the edge of the cabinet. Together, they pushed the heavy wood scraping against the concrete floor. Behind it, a door. Rebecca inhaled sharply. "What the hell is that?" Michael's hands shook as he reached for the handle. It was locked. His mind flashed back to the key in his pocket. The key his mother had left behind. Slowly, he pulled it out, his breath catching as he slid it into the lock. Turned. The door creaked open. Darkness greeted them. A small, hidden room. The air inside was thick, stale. Michael stepped inside cautiously, his fingers trailing along the walls. And then he saw it. A desk, stacks of papers, and a single, framed photograph. Michael's breath caught. It was their mother. Rebecca stepped inside, her hands trembling as she reached for the photograph. "She was here." Michael's throat tightened. "She left this for us." Daniel scanned the papers, his eyes narrowing. "These aren't just letters. These are records, files, documents." Michael leaned over, his pulse pounding. He skimmed the papers. Medical records, case files, reports, and one name that kept appearing over and over again. Dr. Evelyn Carter. Rebecca inhaled sharply. "That's the woman you mentioned before. The one Mom was trying to protect me from." Michael nodded, his stomach twisting. "She's the reason you were taken." Rebecca's hands clenched into fists. "Where is she now?" Michael exhaled slowly. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." Rebecca's breath was unsteady. "Do you think Mom is still alive?" Michael swallowed hard. "I don't know." Rebecca hesitated. Then softly, she whispered, "I think she is." Michael looked at her. Her eyes were filled with something he hadn't seen before. Something raw. Something real. "Hope." Michael exhaled. "Then we find her." Rebecca nodded. Daniel straightened. "And we find out the truth." Michael clenched his jaw. "No more running." Rebecca took a shaky breath. "No more secrets." Michael looked down at the papers in his hands. A new path had opened. The past wasn't over. And this was just the beginning.